A full year at the same table without a word. Then she set her hand on his chest. The bowl she left behind was still on the table when I came in that morning. Oatmeal, gone cold. A spoon lying at an angle across the rim like she'd set it down in the middle of a thought and walked off. I picked the bowl up, carried it to the basin, set it to soak. Went out to feed the horses without another look at it. That was 11 months into her being there. You have to understand something about the quiet before you understand any of the rest. The quiet wasn't cold. Not at first. It wasn't the quiet of two people who despise each other and show it in the dinner table silences. It was more like, I've stood on the edge of a frozen creek in January and felt the thickness of it. The way sound doesn't carry right through that kind of cold. That's what it was. Dense. Present. Not hostile, just sealed over. And I'd decided, sometime around the 3rd or 4th month, that I wasn't going to be the one to try to chip it. The world is full of people who try to chip things that don't want chipping. I've never been one of them. My name is Harlan Cutter. I'm 61 years old and I've worked this same stretch of land since I was 19. My father worked it before me, and his father before him broke the first sod on it with a mule they had to replace twice before the planting was done. We are not people who leave. That's the only plain thing I can tell you about my family. We stay. The land stays. The work stays. When my wife Margaret passed, 9 years before all this happened, I stayed. When the drought took 2 full years of grass and I was feeding the cattle on hay reserves by February, I stayed. When the neighbor to my east sold out to a Kansas speculator, and the neighbor to my west let his property go to ruin, and then his son sold it to another speculator, I stayed. Staying is the only talent I ever had, maybe the only one I needed. Lena Marsh came to board with me in the late spring of the year before this story ends, sent along by Reverend Hogarth over in Sutter's Crossing, because she'd been living in the back room of the church for 2 months, and the Reverend's wife had 4 children and a 5th on the way, and they'd simply run out of room. She arrived in a wagon driven by the Reverend himself, a trunk and a leather case and a crate of books in the wagon bed. And when she climbed down, she looked at my house the way a person looks at a sickbed, taking stock, making peace with it, settling herself towards something that's going to require endurance. I'd agreed to take a boarder because I needed the money that year, and there is no other reason that is honest. $40 a month. She'd have the back room, meals at the table, use of the well and the wash basin on the back porch. In bad weather, the covered passage to the outhouse. Those were the terms. I told the Reverend, and Lena stood slightly behind him, listening without looking at me directly, her eyes going over the property in that same assessing way. She was maybe 38, 40, dark hair with a thread of gray already at the temple, narrow face. Her jaw had a particular set to it, pulled slightly to the left, like she was always holding something in with one side of herself. She wore good clothes that were a little past their time, a green wool traveling dress that had seen too many seasons but was well kept, and her boots were good boots, oiled and solid. Her hands, when she finally shook mine at the Reverend's prompting, were cold and dry and firm, and she let go fast. That was the first time we touched, the last time we touched for 11 months and some days. She thanked me with 3 words, "I appreciate it," and the Reverend drove his wagon back toward the road, and Lena Marsh carried her own trunk into the back room. She had to make 2 trips. I offered to help with the second one. She said she was fine, so that was that. From then until nearly the end of that year, she was at the table at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and we did not speak beyond the necessary syllables. Pass the salt. Is the coffee still hot? That pot needs a new handle. Thank you. Closed loop every exchange. I thought about it sometimes, usually late when I was lying awake listening to the wind off the high plain, what exactly it was she was doing in that back room all those evenings. Reading, I knew that much. I could see the light under her door when I was up at 3 to check the weather. But what the reading was in service of, what she was thinking about, what had put a woman on her own in the back of a church in Sutter's Crossing with a crate of history books, that was none of my concern, and I treated it accordingly. I notice things, though. You notice things when someone lives in your house even if neither of you speaks. I noticed she walked east along the fence line every afternoon around 4, always the exact same path, and always turned back at the old post with the rusted ring bolt on it, never going past. I noticed she had a way of being present at meals, not checked out, not performing ease she didn't feel. There was a particular attentiveness in her that you sensed more than saw, like a person who has learned to track the temperature of a room. I noticed she cried sometimes when she believed I was outside. Not loudly, not in any way she wasn't trying to contain. The sound of it came through the kitchen wall once or twice at odd hours, and I kept moving and said nothing because that is what you do with a woman's private grief. You leave it alone. It doesn't belong to you. I didn't know what the grief was about, and I didn't ask. She'd come from somewhere east Kansas or Missouri, I thought, from a faint flatness in certain vowels when she did speak. And whatever had put her in that back room at Hogarth's church was her own weight to carry. I'm not a curious man by nature. I've found that most people's suffering is their own business, and the kindest thing you can do is not add to it by insisting on knowing the shape of it. The routine settled in by the second month, and by the third month it was fixed. She cooked nothing. That wasn't part of the arrangement, but she washed her own dishes and sometimes mine without being asked, and she swept her doorway on Saturdays, and she never left anything in common spaces except once in a while a book she'd finished, left spine up on the kitchen windowsill in a way that maybe was offering and maybe was just forgetfulness. I never asked. I never touched the books. The arrangement worked because we both understood what it was. I won't pretend it wasn't strange. It is strange to live with a person for months without knowing them. But strange and wrong aren't the same thing, and I'd lived alone long enough that there was something almost restful in having a presence in the house that asked nothing of me beyond the $40 and the seat at the table. Margaret had filled every room she was in. That was her gift, and I loved her for it, and I still missed it. Lena filled the back room and her chair at the table and the fence line east to the ring bolt post, and she left the rest alone. That was its own kind of gift, though I wouldn't have called it that at the time. It was the 8th month, when the thing arrived from outside, that changed everything. It came the way news travels in ranch country, which is sideways and in pieces and smells like the person who's carrying it by the time you hear it. What I heard first was from Del Harmon when I rode over to look at a fence dispute on our shared line. Del is a decent man in most things, but he has a nose for information the way some men have a nose for cards. He always knows more than you think he does, and he's always deciding how much to spend. He said there was talk. I asked what kind of talk. He said the kind about your border. I said go on. He said there were people over in Sutter's Crossing, had been for maybe a month, saying that Lena Marsh wasn't fully white, that her mother had been Kiowa, that she'd hidden it, that the family she'd come from, the Marshes over near Brant County, had kept it quiet for 2 generations and somebody had dug it up, and now it was up. He told me this, watching my face to see what I'd do with it. I said I'd have a look at the fence line and we could sort out the posts on another day, and I rode home. I want to tell you honestly what went through me on that ride, because if I dress it up it becomes the wrong story. What went through me was not shock. What went through me was something closer to comprehension, like a picture that's been slightly blurred suddenly sharpening into focus. I'd lived in that country long enough to have seen what carrying Kiowa blood meant in a white settlement. I'd seen enough of those lives to know what the jaw held to one side probably cost. I thought about the way she moved through that house, careful, contained, always watching the temperature, and I thought about the fence post she never walked past, and the light under the door at 3 in the morning and the sound through the kitchen wall. And what I thought was, of course, not in a cold way, just in the way you think of course when the last piece goes in. What I did not feel was any desire to put her out. I want to be clear about this. It did not enter my head. I don't say it to congratulate myself. I say it because it's true and because what comes next doesn't make sense unless you understand it. I got home before 6. She was at the table when I came in, finishing the last page of something and folding a strip of paper for her place the way she always did. I put supper on the table, a stew that had been going since morning, and we sat down and began the usual way, which is to say without words. About halfway through the meal I said, without looking up from my bowl, "I rode over to Harmon's today." She said nothing. I said, "He told me what's going around in Sutter's Crossing." The room got very still. I looked up. She was looking at the table, not at me. Her hands were flat on either side of the bowl, palms down like she was steadying something. Her jaw was working slightly, the left side set even more pronounced. I said, "You keep your room clean and you pay on time. That's the whole of my concern." She looked up then, just for a moment, a fast look, and then back down at the table. Her spoon hand came back up and she went on eating. That was all I said. That was all she said. But something changed in the kitchen air after that. Something that had been sealed shifted slightly, opened a crack. Not warmly, not right away. Nothing so simple as a wall falling. But the kind of quiet we went back to was not quite the same as the one we'd had before. 3 weeks later at supper she spoke. Not the pass-the-salt variety. She asked me in that careful flat voice with the Eastern vowels in it how long I'd been working this land. I told her. She asked, was I born here or had I come to it? I said I came to it at 19. My father filed the claim when I was still in school in Laramie and sent for me when I was old enough to be useful. She nodded, filing it. And that was 3 sentences and then silence. But the next week she asked something else. Asked about the drought I'd mentioned once in passing, how I'd handled 2 years without grass. I told her. She listened the way she had that first morning, that active filing attention, like she was building something in her mind with the pieces. And the week after that she asked something else. It was like watching ice go out in spring. You don't see it happening. Then one day there's open water where there wasn't, and you can't point to the moment it changed. But then the thing in Sutter's Crossing broke open in a way that made Del Harmon's fence line conversation look like nothing. I heard it from the boy who delivers feed, 17, no filter on him. Told me straight out that a group of men, 6 or so, had gone to Reverend Hogarth and told him that housing Lena Marsh anywhere in the territory was a problem. That she deceived people about what she was. That the blood in her made her something other than what she'd presented, and they didn't want her in Sutter's Crossing, and they didn't want her on the surrounding ranches either. And if she was still in the territory by the end of the month, they'd handle the matter themselves. The boy told me this the way you'd report a change in feed prices. He didn't know what he was handing me. I thanked him, unloaded the feed, and stood in the barn for a while with my hands on the top rail of the pen, watching one of the mares eat. The mare had no opinion about any of this. There is a particular comfort in an animal's indifference to human foolishness. I stood there until the comfort settled in properly, and then I thought about what I was going to do. 6 men. I knew at least 3 of them by name without being told, the kind every territory has, the kind who call themselves guardians of something, but what they're really guarding is a story about themselves and their place in the order of things. I'd known men like that all my life. They don't usually do what they say they'll do. But sometimes they do, and you can't know ahead of time which kind of time this is, and a woman alone in a back room 6 miles from town doesn't get to gamble on the question. I came in for supper later than usual, 6:30 or so. She'd left the stew warming on the back of the stove with a cloth draped over it, which she'd never done before. She was at the table with a book, but she wasn't reading it. She looked up when I came in. I got the stew, sat down. I said, "The boy from Dawes Feed told me about the men in Sutter's Crossing." Her hand on the book cover tightened. I said, "I want you to know you're staying here, if that's what you want." Quiet, then carefully, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know I don't have to. I'm telling you what I'm doing." She looked at me, longer than the look in the 8th month. Her eyes were dark. I'd noticed this about her from the first. It's not the kind of thing you don't notice in a face that otherwise gives so little, and there was something in them I recognized without being able to name it right. The look of someone standing at the edge of ground they're not certain will hold them, testing before they step. I said, I've got a rifle, and I've been using it since before half those men were born. Anyone who comes onto this property without being asked will understand the situation quickly. She looked at the table. Something moved in her throat. She said, my mother was not a bad person. I hadn't expected that. I said, I didn't think she was. She said, people act like it's a contamination. Like she was the wrong thing, and it passed to me. The flat voice had gone just slightly uneven at the edges, barely, like a board with a hairline crack. My father knew from the beginning. He always knew. We didn't announce it because you've seen what happens when people find out. I said yes. She said, I'm sorry I didn't tell you before you agreed to board me. I said, you don't owe me any accounting of your blood, not to me or anyone else. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're a strange man, Harlan Cutter. I said I'd been told that before, and I got up and rinsed my bowl, and that was supper. But that night I sat on the front porch later than I usually sit, watching the dark out toward the road, and I thought about those 6 men. Thought about how I was going to handle whatever came, and what I felt wasn't anger exactly, though anger was part of it. What I felt was the thing that comes when a purpose is clear and simple, when the noise goes out of you and you know exactly what your hands are for. It's the cleanest feeling I know. I don't get it often. I got it that night. What came was not 6 men riding in together. It was 2 men, 3 nights later, at about 9 in the evening. They came with their horses tied at the road and walked up on foot, which told me they weren't entirely certain of their own nerve. I was on the porch. I'd been on the porch every evening since the feed boy told me. I had the rifle across my knees and the lamp lit behind me, so I was visible, and I watched them come up the path from the road. They stopped at the edge of the lamp light. I knew both of them. One was Cass Pettigrew, the nephew, 25 or so, a soft young man who was harder when he was with others and softer when he wasn't. The other was a man named Borst who took odd jobs around the county and never kept them, a man I'd always found to have more performance in him than substance. Both of them were looking at the rifle on my knees. I said, evening. Cass Pettigrew said I ought to know the feeling in Sutter's Crossing about the matter of my boarder. I said I'd heard something of it. He said it would be better for everyone if she was gone by the end of the week. I said, she's not going anywhere. He said, did I understand what she was? I said, I understand what you are, and I'm telling you the same thing I'd tell any man who walked up to my property uninvited to tell me how to run my own house. You're done here. Go home. Borst said something under his breath. Cass Pettigrew looked at the rifle for a moment longer. Then they turned and went back down toward the road. I sat on the porch another 2 hours. Lena was watching from the window. I'd seen the curtain shift when they came up the path. When I came inside, she was standing in the kitchen doorway with a lamp, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She said, are they coming back? I said I didn't think so, but I'd keep an eye on things for a few nights. She said, Harlan. It was the first time she'd used my given name, 11 months and some days. She said, why are you doing this? I thought about it. I'm not a fast-answering man. Margaret used to say waiting for me was like waiting for a well to fill. You just had to give it time. I said, because it's right, and because this is my land and nobody tells me what happens on it. I paused. And because you keep a clean house and pay your rent, and I said what I meant when I said that was the whole of my concern. She stood in the doorway and looked at me for a long time. The lamp she held made her face warm and plain, the jaw straighter than usual, her eyes doing that edge-of-the-ice-testing thing. Then she said, very quietly, my mother's name was Chasing Water. She was from a band that broke up when she was 12. She never talked about it much, not to me. She made the best cornbread I ever ate in my life. I said, she sounds like a woman. Something broke in Lena then, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small sound, something between a breath and a laugh, and she looked away for a moment and then back. And she said good night and went to her room, and I went to mine. That was October. After that we talked. Not at length right away, but the density of the silence had changed so thoroughly by then that what was left of it was the ordinary quiet of two private people living in the same space. She asked me about the cattle, and I explained what I was planning. I asked about her books. She read history, which surprised me, and she caught the surprise and asked did that seem odd. I said I'd expected novels. She said novels made her impatient. She wanted to know what had actually happened in the world. I said I felt the same way. She looked at me like she was recalibrating something she'd measured before. Winter came. The days got short and the house was warmer with two people in it, just in the practical fact of two lamps burning and two bodies generating heat in a small space. She started cooking some evenings when I was in late, not asking, just doing, the way useful people do useful things without requiring acknowledgement. I ate whatever she made without comment except to say it was good when it was, which was every time. There was an evening in January when the wind came down off the high plain hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames. The lamp in the kitchen guttered twice. She was at the table writing a letter and she looked up at the sound of the wind, and there was something in her face that I recognized, not quite fear, but an old wariness, the expression of a person who has spent a long time checking for exits. And I said, without planning to say it, nobody's getting to you through that wind. She looked at me. I said, the wind is just wind. She went back to her letter, and after a moment she said quietly, I know that. But I think she'd needed to hear it said. That's what I thought anyway. There's no dishonest way to tell this. You can't pull the thread out of the cloth and still have the cloth. A man and a woman living in a house for a year, both private people, both carrying wounds they've learned to carry quietly, both accustomed to their own company. The thing that happens between them doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like anything in particular while it's happening. It looks like passing the salt and asking about the fence line and whether there's coffee left on the stove. I won't rush the winter because I don't think the winter should be rushed. It was a good one, that winter. Not because anything happened, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a story by itself. But there was a quality to those months that I think about still. The particular quiet of the house with two lamps instead of one. The sound of her moving in the kitchen when I was working at the table. The way she'd leave tea on the stove after 9 o'clock, which I'd never drunk before but I started to then, just because it was there and it was something she'd done. Small things. But small things are what most of a life is made of, and anyone who says otherwise has been writing poetry instead of living. We talked about her father some over those months. He'd been a soil man, a homesteader, worked a stretch of ground in Kansas that he'd had to let go after 2 bad years in the 70s. She said he'd been a patient man. Said he'd had to be, married to a woman who came from people who didn't trust patience as a virtue. Her mother's people had not had much cause to find patience rewarded. I asked what happened to her mother. She said her mother died when Lena was 14, fever in the summer of '62. She said her mother had made the cornbread every Sunday of her life that Lena could remember, and she'd never once seen her consult a recipe. I said that kind of knowledge lives in the hands. Lena said yes. That's exactly right, she said, in the hands. I told her about Margaret some. It wasn't easy. I'm not a man who talks about his losses easily. I tend to carry them in the way that hardworking people tend to carry things, which is to say efficiently, compactly, without much display. But something about the winter and the lamp and the sound of the wind made it easier, and I told her about the 22 years and about Margaret's way of filling every room she was in, which had been her gift. Lena listened without making a face of sympathy, which I appreciated. She just listened, and when I was done she said, "She sounds like a woman who knew her own worth." I said she did. Lena said that's rare. I said yes. We went back to quiet after that, but it was warm quiet, a different quality of it altogether from the frozen creek of those first months. February was when the second piece of trouble came, and this one was different in the way serious trouble is always different from the preliminary kind. A man named Ira Fitch came to the door on a Tuesday morning. I knew Fitch. He ran the land office in Sutter's Crossing, and he was the kind of man who calls himself neutral, but is always on the side of whoever makes his professional life easier. He said he'd had a visit from several county residents who felt that my property, by housing Lena Marsh, was creating an unsafe situation for the surrounding territory. He used the word unsafe in the way people use words they know to be lies, but that they've agreed to call polite. He said there were legal avenues available for the removal of an individual who had created a public disturbance. I said I didn't know of any public disturbance. I said the woman in my house had paid her rent, kept to herself, and gone to no public places where anyone was required to lay eyes on her. I said if anyone was creating a disturbance, it was the men going to his office to complain about a woman who had done nothing to any of them. He said there were legal avenues again. I said, Fitch, you drove out here because you thought if you said legal and avenue I'd be impressed enough to do what you're asking. I'm not. You go back and you tell whoever sent you that the next person who sets foot on this land with a view to removing my border will have cause to regret it in a specific and immediate way. I think you understand what I mean. I said it quietly. I find that quiet carries further than loud when the meaning is right. He drove his wagon back to Sutter's Crossing. I went inside and stood at the kitchen sink and washed my hands for a while, which is what I do when I've had to be harder than comes naturally to me. I am not a man who enjoys conflict. People sometimes mistake calm for comfort. Calm is not comfort. Calm is just how I'm made. Lena was not in the kitchen, but she'd heard everything. I knew she had. The window was cracked and Fitch's voice carries. I dried my hands and went back out to work and didn't say anything about it until supper. At supper she sat across from me and we ate for a while, and then she said, not looking up, "You didn't have to do that. I could find another situation." I said, "Where?" She looked up. I said, "Where would you go? Who else in this territory is going to board you once this has gone as far as it's gone?" Sutter's Crossing, the county the Pettigrews run. I'm asking you a real question. She looked back down. I said, "I'm not saying it to be hard on you. I'm saying it because you're not leaving here to make Ira Fitch more comfortable in his office. If you want to leave for your own reasons, because this place doesn't suit you, because you found somewhere better, because you want to, that's a different thing entirely, and I'll help you get there. But you don't go because of those men." Quiet for a while. She said, "My father used to say something like that." I asked what he used to say. She said, "Don't make yourself small so other people don't have to look up." She paused. "He said it a lot. I don't know that I ever figured out how to do it." I said, "You figured out some of it." She looked at me. I said, "A woman who holds herself together the way you've held yourself together in the last year has figured out some of it." She looked at the table. After a moment she said, "He'd have liked you." I didn't know what to say to that. I went on eating and so did she, and the night was quiet outside, just the creek sound and the horses shifting in the barn, and that was February. March brought the thaw. The light came back the way it does on the plains, tentatively at first and then all at once, and there was a particular afternoon in the middle of the month when I was working the gate on the north pasture, and the sun was warm enough to feel for the first time since October. I looked up because some noise from the east made me look, and I saw her on the fence line. She'd shed the heavy coat and was walking in just a wool jacket, her hair loose in the wind, coming back from the ring bolt post the way she always did. She was not aware of me watching. She was just walking, and the light was on her, and something I had not been allowing myself to name sat down squarely in my chest and looked at me. I'm 61 years old. I know what loneliness is. I know what it feels like when it lifts. What I felt in that moment watching her was something I had no intention of doing anything about, and I went back to the gate. But then she came past on her way back to the house, and she stopped. She looked at the north section cattle through the fence for a moment, and she said, "The cattle in the north section look thin." I said they'd been worrying me some. The grass was slow this year. She said, "Can you move them to the creek section for another month?" I said the creek section was already holding too many head. She said, "What if you sold the 4 oldest first? The weight you'd gain on the creek section grass would more than offset the loss from selling early, and you'd have the space." I looked up from the gate. She was standing there with one hand shading her eyes, completely matter-of-fact about it, like it was just arithmetic. I said, "That's not a bad thought." She said, "I've been thinking about it for a week. The 4 oldest are probably pulling your average weight down anyway." I said, "You worked that out from watching them." She said, "My father ran 300 head for 12 years. I know what thin cattle look like, and I know what the math is." A small pause. I should have said something sooner. I said, "You can say things sooner. I'm listening." She looked at me in that edge-of-the-ice way, and then she went to the house. I stood at that gate for a while, thought about a woman who'd been in my house for nearly a year, watching my cattle, working the weight calculations in her head, and waiting for 11 months to see if it was safe to say something useful. Thought about what that kind of waiting costs, what it costs a person to be that careful for that long. I didn't have answers. I fixed the gate and moved the cattle. She was right about the north section. She was right about the 4 oldest. The creek section grass came in strong in April, and by the 1st of May I had 40 pounds back on the remaining herd average. I told her at supper one evening in May, and she said, without any particular expression, "I thought it would work," and went back to her food. April brought one more piece of business. Not men at the road this time. A letter to me, written by a man named Claude Tanner who ran the County Cattlemen's Association, saying he'd heard about my situation regarding a boarder, and that the association wanted me to know they were watching to see how I handled it. Polite language. But the message was clear enough. They were leaning on the side of the men from Sutter's Crossing, and they wanted me to know my standing in the association was under their consideration. I wrote back on the same day. Said my standing in the association was something I'd worry about once the association started worrying about the quality of its members' character, and until that time they could keep their consideration. Signed it Harlan Cutter, no salutation at either end. I did not tell Lena about this letter. She had enough to carry. The letter I did not tell her about came on a Tuesday. The letter I heard about from her came on a Wednesday. She came to the kitchen doorway after supper, and she said there was something she needed to tell me. I said, "Go ahead." She said she'd had a letter from her sister in Missouri, and the sister had found a situation for her, a school-teaching position in a town called Abilene, starting in the fall. A proper situation, a room included, a school with 30 pupils. She said this looking at the middle of the kitchen, not at me. She said the sister had pulled in a favor from someone she knew there, and it was a solid opportunity, and she'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks and she thought she might take it. I said, "That sounds like a good opportunity." She said, "Yes." I said, "You'd be good at it, the teaching." She said, "I've done it before all of this. I had a position in Brant County." I said, "Then you know what you're doing." She said, "Yes." We stood there for a moment. Then I said, "When do they need to know?" She said, "By the end of the month." I said I understood, and I went out to check on the horses, and I stood in the barn for a long time in the way I'd stood there in the fall when the feed boy told me about the men from Sutter's Crossing. Except this time, I didn't feel the clarity I'd felt then. This time, I just felt the particular weight of something you've been holding without knowing you were holding it. I want to be honest. I thought she was going to take it. I thought that was right, probably. A woman with that much held inside her deserved a place where she could open some of it up, a schoolroom of her own, 30 children who needed what she could give them. I thought about it for several nights, and I came to the conclusion that if she decided to go, I would mean what I'd said. I'd help her get there. Find a wagon, write a reference, whatever she needed. But I was also 61 years old, and I'd been alone for 9 years, and I knew what this winter had been. Not what it had held. Nothing had happened. I'm not telling you anything happened. I'm telling you what the winter had been in the quality of it, in the warmth of 2 lamps instead of 1, in the tea left on the stove, and the census of cattle she'd been keeping in her head on my behalf. I knew what I'd lose if she went to Missouri for 3 weeks to see her sister, and then went to Abilene in September. I said nothing. I let her think about it. The night she set her hand on my chest came 3 weeks later. It was a Thursday, late April, still light past 7. We'd eaten supper. She'd gone to her room, and I'd assumed the evening was settled. I was at the kitchen table going over the accounts. The Creek section cattle were doing well. The sale of the 4 oldest had come out about where she'd said it would. I was in better shape going into summer than I'd been in 3 years, and I was making a note in the ledger when I heard her door open. She came out to the kitchen. She had her shawl around her shoulders the way she wore it when she'd been sitting for a while and got cold. She stood at the edge of the lamp's reach and said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Why does a man like you live alone?" I looked up. She was watching me with those steady dark eyes, not testing now, just asking, genuinely wanting the answer. I said, "My wife died 9 years ago." She said, "That's not what I asked." I set down the pencil. "What did you ask?" She said, "I asked why a man like you lives alone. A man who gets up before the sky does in February to feed his cattle in the dark. A man who sits on his porch for 2 hours because 2 men might come back who probably won't. A man who says you keep your room clean and you pay on time when he could have said anything else and none of it would have been wrong." She stopped. "I want to know why nobody's seen you." That sat in the kitchen air for a moment. I said Margaret saw me, and then she was gone. She came a little further into the lamp's reach. She said, "And since then?" I said, "Since then I've been here." She said, 9 years of here." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for a long time, long enough that the lamp flame moved once in a draft from somewhere. Then she walked the rest of the way across the kitchen, and she stood in front of me, and she reached out and set her hand flat on my chest, right over where the heart is. She wasn't pressing hard, just placed it there, still and certain, the way you place something you're sure of. She said, "I see you, Harlan." I did not move. I don't think I breathed. She said, "I've been trying to find a way to say that for a while. I don't know how to say it differently than this." Her hand was warm through my shirt. I could feel the weight of it, the specific pressure of it, the small bones in her palm against me. I looked at her face, this face I'd been looking at across the table for a year without letting myself really look at it, and she looked back at me, and neither of us looked away. I put my hand over hers, just covered it. Her hand was warm, and I could feel it even through mine, the steady warmth of it. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "I see you too, Lena." She let out a breath, quiet, not dramatic, not a sound for anyone but the 2 of us in that kitchen. A held thing let go, and she stood there with my hand over hers for a while, the lamp on the table between us, the night outside full of the new grass smell coming through the cracked window. I could hear the horses in the barn, the sound they make when they've settled for the night and the world is still. A sound I've heard every night of my adult life and never thought to mention to anyone. After a while she said, "I'm not going to Abilene." I said, "All right." She said, "I want to stay here." I said, "I want you to stay." She nodded. Her jaw settled straight, the way it would stay from then on. Something in her whole face settled with it. She took her hand back slow, and I let her, and she went to the stove and put the kettle on, and I went back to the accounts. We didn't speak again until the kettle was ready and she poured 2 cups and set one by my elbow without asking. I said thank you without looking up. She sat back down with her book. We spent the rest of that evening in the kitchen, each to our own work, the lamp burning between us, entirely easy. I want to tell you the next morning because that's the part I think about most when I think about it at all. I came in from the early feeding. It was still cold in the morning that time of April, and she was already at the stove. Not the oatmeal she usually made. She'd made eggs, the kind with the edges gone a little crisp the way I've always liked but never said, and biscuits, which I hadn't had since Margaret's time, and coffee strong and already poured. She turned when I came in the door. She looked at me, not with anything complicated in it, not with sentiment, just the way a woman looks at a man she has decided on, plain and steady and certain. I sat down and I ate. She sat across from me and she ate. We talked about the cattle, about whether the spring would be wet, about a book she was reading on the history of land grants in the territories. Ordinary things. But underneath the ordinary things there was something that hadn't been there the morning before, some current, some warmth running under the surface of all of it, and it was enough. More than enough. More than I'd had in 9 years. I am 61 years old. I have worked this land for 42 years. I've lost one woman I loved and come out the other side of that loss, and I've been alone long enough to know what being alone costs, what it takes from you slowly, what you forget you're missing, what you lose track of. What you lose track of is the sound of another person in the house at 3 in the morning, the particular warmth of someone else's lamp through a wall, the weight of a hand placed flat on your chest by someone who knows what they're doing when they place it. That morning at the kitchen table, Lena Marsh looked at me across the biscuits and the coffee and the ordinary business of a Thursday, and what I saw in her face was not pity and not charity, and not a woman making do with what was available. It was a woman who had held herself together through things that would have undone most people, who had kept her own worth intact through a year of careful silence in a stranger's house, who had tested the ground until she was sure of it, and who had decided freely, with her eyes open, knowing exactly what she was deciding, that this was the ground worth standing on. That I was. I don't know how to tell you what that is worth. I could tell you what the land is worth. I could give you a number. I could tell you what the herd is worth. I know that figure down to the dollar. But what it's worth to have a good woman look at you like that, a woman who has seen you clearly and not found anything to run from, I don't have a way to put a number on it, and I'm not going to try. We finished breakfast. She washed the dishes and I dried them, and then I went out to work and she went to her books, and outside the spring grass was coming in green along the fence lines, and the horses were running the south pasture the way they run when the weather is right and they're glad of it. The ring-bolt post at the east end of the property stood where it always had, solid in the ground. She'd walk out there at 4, same as always. Only now I'd be watching from the north pasture and she'd know it, and neither of us would say a word about it. That was enough. That's always been enough. I should tell you about the summer before all of this, the summer she arrived, because otherwise you don't have the whole picture. You don't know what I was that year. I was thin. I don't mean the word loosely. I'd lost weight I hadn't had to spare, from a spring that had gone wrong before it started. Lost a heifer to a snake strike in March, which sounds like a small thing until you run the math. Then one of the well ropes gave in April and I was hauling water by bucket for 3 weeks while I sourced the right braid. And in May the north fence line went down after a flash storm and I spent 4 days repairing it alone, which at 60 is not 4 days at 40. By the time Hogarth's wagon came up the road with Lena Marsh, in it I was the kind of tired that doesn't show in your face, because it's too deep in the bone for the surface to reflect. I'm telling you this because when she climbed down from that wagon and looked at the house like she was making peace with a sickbed, I probably looked like I came with the house, like one of its original fixtures, sun-worn and functional and not much more. I don't think she was afraid of me. I think she simply did not see me as a person yet. I was a roof and a stove and a man who would leave her alone, which is probably all she needed that June. and I didn't see her as much more than the $40, which is honest, which is what I have to work with when I tell this story, the honest version, not the dressed-up one. The first month was what it was. Two private people in a house that's too quiet, making it more so. The second month was the same. I've already told you about the third and fourth months, the decision I made not to chip at the ice. What I haven't told you is what I was doing in those months besides the ranch work. I was reading. Margaret had left a full shelf of books, novels, mostly, the kind with thick spines that last, and I hadn't touched them since she died. I dusted them twice a year and left them exactly where she'd put them. But that fall, something about having Lena's light under the door until 2 in the morning made me go to the shelf one evening. I didn't take a novel. I took a survey of the Northern Territories that I'd bought 10 years before and never opened. I read it at the kitchen table after supper, same table where Lena was finishing her day's last pages before she retired. We didn't discuss what we were reading. That wasn't how it worked yet, but I think there was something in the fact of it, two people at the same table with two different books, that made the silence a different shape than it had been before. Less like absence, more like agreement. The survey of the Northern Territories led me to a history of the cattle drives, which led me to a geological account of the plains formations, and by December I was into a second-hand copy of something about the treaty negotiations of the 1860s that I'd found in Sutter's Crossing the fall before and never gotten around to. I was reading about Fort Laramie on a January night when Lena, setting her own book down, said, "What are you reading?" I showed her the cover. She said, "That's a good one. The author got it wrong in the 3rd chapter, but he's careful about the rest." I said, "What did he get wrong in the 3rd chapter?" She told me. She knew the history, knew it the way someone knows something that is also personal to them, with more depth and more exactness than a person who's read it purely for interest. I listened. When she was done, I said, "Your mother's people were in those negotiations." She said her father was, my grandfather. He died before I was born. A pause. I've been looking for accounts of it for years. That book is the closest I've found. I said, "You can keep it when I'm done." She looked at me. I said I was only going to read it once. She said, "Thank you, Harlan." First time she'd used my name. I know I told you the night of the 2 men on the porch was the first time, and I was wrong by one. This was the first, January, over the treaty book. I just didn't register it properly until the porch night, when it landed differently. That's what I mean about memory. It goes slightly out of order and circles back, and what you think is first sometimes turns out to be second on reflection. She took the treaty book in March when I finished it, and I saw her reading it at the table one evening in April. Just before the night she set her hand on my chest, and she had a look on her face reading it that I recognized from nowhere I could name. Not sorrow exactly, but the face of someone measuring the distance between what was and what might have been, and finding the distance long. I didn't say anything about that face. I just let her read. There's one more thing I need to tell you about that year, a small thing, but I think it matters. In February, 2 or 3 weeks after Ira Fitch came in his wagon, I came in from a long, cold morning of fence repair, and there was a pie on the kitchen table. Apple pie, the kind with a proper latticework crust, still warm with a cloth draped over it. No note. She was in her room. I stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at it. At supper I said, "That pie was very good." She said, "I found apples in the root cellar. They would have gone soft by April anyway." I said, "Still." She said, "You've been fixing fence in the cold for 3 weeks straight. You needed something hot." I said, "That's practical of you." She looked at me with something in her eyes that was almost amusement, almost just at the corners. She said, "I'm a practical woman." I said, "I know that about you." She went back to her supper. I went back to mine. But I want you to know about the pie, because the pie is what the $40 a month turned into over a year. Not the money, never the money is just the money. But what was underneath the money, What was underneath the arrangement, what two people accumulate without knowing it when they share a table in the same house for 12 months, that's harder to name. The pie is the closest thing I have to a name for it. She saw what the 3 weeks of fence work in the cold cost me, and she made something warm for it. That's it. That's all the pie is, but that's also everything. I am 61 years old and I have worked hard ground my whole life, and I know the difference between a woman who sees you and a woman who is in the same room as you. The difference is the pie. The difference is the cattle math she did for 11 months before she said it. The difference is the way she stayed in that back room in a house where nobody asked her questions and nobody demanded anything of her, and waited with the quiet patience of someone who has learned to wait and chose this. That's what I want you to hear in all of this, not the men at the road, not Ira Fitch, not even the hand on my chest, though that's what I called this story. That's where it ends and where it earns to end. What I want you to hear is the year, the 12 months, the table we sat at without speaking for more of them than we spoke, and what built up in that silence, the way pressure builds in good ground before something grows. She set her hand on my chest because she'd spent a year deciding I was worth it. That's the thing I keep. That's the thing that at 61, 9 years on the far side of loss, I did not expect to get again and got. Outside, spring, the grass coming in along the fence lines, the horses in the pasture, the ring bolt post at the east edge of my land, solid and rusted and right where it's always been. That's enough, more than enough.